on, folks. Open Season, the first Joe Pickett novel by C.J. Box. Part 1. Findings, Purposes, and Policy. Purposes. The purposes of this act are to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered species and threatened species depend may be conserved, to provide a program for the conservation of such endangered species and threatened species, and to take such steps as may be appropriate to achieve the purposes of the treaties and conventions set forth in the subsections of this section. The Endangered Species Act amendments of 1982, printed for the use of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, United States Government Printing Office, Washington, 1983. Chapter 1. Okay. Joe lived, but it wasn't something he was particularly proud of. It was now fall, and Sunday morning dawned slate gray and cold. He was making pancakes for his girls when he first heard of the bloody beast who had come down from the mountains and tried to enter the house during the night. 7-year-old Sheridan Pickett related her drama aloud to the stuffed bear that served as her confidant. Lucy, 3 and horrified, listened in. The television set was on, even though the reception from the vintage satellite dish was snowing and poor as usual. The monster, Sheridan said, had come down from the mountains through the dark, steep canyon behind the house very late last night. She watched it through a slit in the curtain on her window, just a few inches from the top bunk of her bed. The canyon was where Sheridan had always suspected a monster would come from, and she felt proud, if a bit fearful, that she had been right. Okay. The only light had been the moon through the dried leaves of the cottonwood tree. The monster had rattled the back gate before figuring out the latch, and then lurched clumsily, sort of like mummies in old movies, across the yard to the back door. Its eyes and teeth glinted yellow, and for a second Sheridan felt an electric bolt jolt through her as the monster's head swirled around and seemed to look directly at her before it fled. The monster was hairy and shiny as if covered with liquid. Twigs and leaves were stuck to it. There was something white, a large sack or box, swinging from the monster's hand. "Sheridan, stop talking about monsters," Joe called out. The dream disturbed him because the details were so precise. Sheridan's dreams were usually more fantastic, inhabited by talking pets or magical things that flew. "I want to scare your little sister." "I'm already scared," Lucy declared, pulling her blanket to her mouth. And then a man walked slowly away across the yard through the gate toward the woodpile, where he fell down into a big shadow. "He's still out there," Sheridan finished, winding her eyes toward her sister to deliver the complete effect. "Hold it, Sheridan," Joe said abruptly, entering the room with a spatula in his hand. Joe was wearing his threadbare terry cloth bathrobe he had purchased just on the Larkin Jackson hole on his and Mary Beth's honeymoon 10 years before. He shopped with fleece slippers. Uppers were a size too large. "You said meh. You didn't say monster. You said meh." Sharon looked up quizzically, her big eyes wide. "Maybe it wasn't me. Maybe it wasn't a dream after all." Joe heard a vehicle outside racing the gravel Bighorn Road much too fast, but by the time he crossed the living room and parted the folded drapes of the picture window, the car truck was gone. Gus rolled lazily down the road where it had been. Beyond the window was the front yard, still green from summer and littered with plastic toys. Then there was the white fence, recently painted, paralleled by the gravel road. Farther beyond the road, the landscape dipped into a willow-choked saddle, where the 12-Sleep River branched out into 6 winged fingers clogged with heavier ponds and brackish mosquito heaven eddies, and paused for a breath before its muscular rush through and past the town of Saddle Street. Beyond were the folds of the valley as it arched and suddenly climbed to form a precipitous mountain face known as Wolf Mountain, a peak in the 12 Sleep Range. With Wolf Mountain in front of them and the foothills and canyon in back, the Pickett family, 8 miles from town in their house, lived a life deep and cast in shadows. The front door opened and Maxine burst in, followed by Mary Beth. Mary Beth's cheeks were flushed, either from the brisk cold air or her long walk with the dog. Joe wasn't sure which, and she looked annoyed. She wore her winter walking uniform with lightweight hiking boots, chinos, anorak, and wool hat. The anorak was stretched tight across her pregnant belly. "It's cold out there," Mary Beth said, peeling the hat off so her blonde hair tumbled onto her shoulders. "Did you see the truck? Back tab out here. That was Sheriff Barnum's truck going too fast on that road up to the mountain." "Barnum?" Joe said, genuinely puzzled. "Your dog was going nuts when we got back to the house. She only took my arm off just a minute ago." Mary Beth unclipped Maxine's lace from her collar, and Maxine padded toward the water dish and drank sloppily. Joe had a blank expression on his face while he was thinking. The expression sometimes annoyed Mary Beth, who was afraid people would think him simple. It was the same expression in a photograph that had been transmitted throughout the region via the Associated Press when Joe, while still a trainee, had arrested a tall man who turned out to be the new governor of Wyoming for fishing without a license. Where did Maxine want to go? She wanted to go out back, she said, toward the woodpile. Joe turned around. Sheridan and Lucy had paused at breakfast and were looking to him. Lucy looked away and resumed eating. Sheridan held his gaze and she nodded triumphantly. "Better take your gun," Sheridan said. Joe managed a grin. "Eat your breakfast," he said. "What's this all about?" Mary Beth asked. "Bloody monster," she said. And set her eyes wide. "There's a bloody monster in the woodpile." Suddenly there was the roar of motors coming up Bighorn Road from Saddle Stream. Joe was thinking exactly what Mary Beth said next. Something's going on. I wonder why nobody called here. Joe looked at the telephone receiver to make sure it was working. The dial tone echoed clearly into his ear. "Maybe it's because you're the new guy. People here still can't get used to the fact that Vern Dunnigan isn't around anymore," Mary Beth said, and Joe knew instantly she wished she could take it back. "Dad, about that monster?" Sheridan said from the table, almost apologetic. Joe buckled his holster over his bathrobe, clamped on his black Stetson, and stepped outside into the black porch. He was surprised how cool and crisp it was this early in the fall. When he saw the large spatters of dried blood between his oversized fleece slippers, the chill suddenly became more pronounced. Joe pulled his revolver and broke the cylinder to make sure it was loaded. Then he glanced over his shoulder. Framed in the dining room window were Sheridan and Lucy. Mary Beth stood behind them and off to the side. His 3 girls in the window were various stages of the same painfully beautiful blonde and willowy female. Their green eyes were on him, and their faces were wide open. He knew how silly he must look. He couldn't tell if they could see what he could. Splashes of blood in the ancient concrete walkway that halved the yard, and crushed frozen grass where it happened that summer or something had rolled. It looked almost like the night nesting place of a large deer or elk, the way the grass and crisp autumn leaves had been flattened. Grasping the pistol in front of him with both hands, Joe skirted a young pine and stepped through the open gate of the weathered fence to the place where the woodpile was. Joe sucked in his breath and involuntarily stepped back, his ears filled with the whooping sound of his own heart beating. A big, bearded man was sprawled across the woodpile, both of his large hands folded across his belly, palms down, and one leg cocked over his stump. The man's head rested in the log, his mouth parted just enough to show 2 rows of yellow teeth that looked like corn on the cob. His eyelids weren't completely shut, and where there should have been a moist reflection from his eyes, there was instead a dull, dry membrane that looked like crinkled cellophane. His long hair and full beard was matted by blood into crude dreadlocks. The man wore a thick beige chamois shirt and jeans, and broad stripes of dark blood had coursed down both. It was Oat Keeley, and Oat looked dead. Oat reached out and touched Oat's mealy, pale white hand. His skin was cold and did not give to the touch, except for the dried blood in his hair and on his clothes and his waxy skin. Oat looked to be very comfortable. He could have been reclining in his lazy boy, having a beer and watching the Bronco game on television. Clutched in one of Oat Keeley's hands was the handle of a small plastic cooler minus the lid. Joe kneeled down and looked into the cooler, which was empty except for a scatter of small teardrop-shaped animal shit. The inside walls of the cooler were scratched and scarred as if clawed. Whatever had been in there had been manic about getting out, and it succeeded. Damn! Joe stood and saw the extra buckskin horse standing near the corral. The horse was saddled and the reins hung down from the bridle. The horse had been ridden hard and had lost enough weight that the cinch slipped and the saddle hung loose and upside down. Joe stared at Oat's blank face, recalling that day in June when Oat had pointed Joe's own pistol at his face and cocked the hammer. Even though Oat had thought better of it and had sighed theatrically and spun the weapon around butt first with his finger in the trigger guard like the Lone Ranger, Joe had never quite been the same. He had been expecting to die at that moment. And for all practical purposes, he deserved to die, having given up his weapon so stupidly. But it hadn't happened. Joe had holstered his revolver with his hands shaking so badly that the barrel of the revolver rattled around the mouth of the holster. His knees had been so weak that he backed up against his pickup to brace himself, so he wouldn't collapse. Bud had simply watched him with an amused expression on his face. Without a word, Joe had written down on the citation for poaching in a shaking scrawl and handed the ticket to Oak Keeley, who took it and stuffed it in his pocket without even looking at it. "I won't say nothing if you don't about what just happened," Oak had said. Joe hadn't acknowledged the offer, but he hadn't arrested Oat either. The deal had been struck. Oat's silence in exchange for Joe's life and career. It was a deal Joe agonized over later, usually late at night. Oak Keeley had taken something from him that he could never get back. In a way, Oak Keeley had killed Joe, just a little bit. Joe hated him for that, although he never said a word to anyone except Mary Beth. What made it worse was when word of the incident filtered out anyway. During the summer, Oat had gotten drunk and told everyone at the bar what happened. The story about the new game warden losing his weapon to a local outfitter had joyously made the rounds and never appeared in the wicked anonymous column ranch gossip that ran in the weekly South Street Roundup. It was the kind of story the locals loved. In the latest version, Joe lost control of his sphincter and had begged Oat for the gun back. Joe's supervisor in Cheyenne heard the rumors and had called Joe. Joe confirmed what had actually happened. In spite of Joe's explanation, the supervisor sent Joe a reprimand that would stay in his personnel file forever. An investigation was still possible. Keeley's poaching trial date had been set to take place in 2 weeks, but obviously Oat wouldn't be appearing. Oat Keeley was the first dead person Joe had ever seen, except in a coffin or at a funeral. There was nothing alive or real about Oat's expression. He did not look happy, puzzled, sad, or in pain. The look in his face, frozen by death and for several hours, told Joe nothing about what Oat was thinking or feeling when he died. Joe fought an urge to reach up and close Oat's eyes and mouth to make him look more like he was sleeping. Joe had seen a lot of dead, big game animals, but only the stillness and the salt-ripe odor was the same. When he saw dead animals, he had many different emotions, depending on the circumstances, from indifference to pity and sometimes to quiet rage aimed at careless hunters. This was different, Joe thought, because the dead body was human and could be him. Truman himself stopped staring. Joe stood up. There had been a monster. He heard something and turned around. The back door slammed shut and Sheridan was coming out in her nightgown, skipping down the walk with her hands in the air. See what he had found. "Get back into that house!" Joe commanded with such unexpected force that Sheridan spun on her bare feet and flew right back inside. On his way through the house and to the phone, Joel told Mary Beth who the dead man was.